Chapter 6: The 1920s. Tennessee's greatest hero. When asked to name the biggest hero from Tennessee, Americans tend to name Davy Crockett, and there is no doubt that the man who lost his life at the Battle of the Alamo was very popular. However, in sheer effectiveness and efficiency, it is very hard to equal the legacy of Sergeant Alvin C. York. Born and raised in Fentress County, Tennessee, Alvin York was from a family of farmers and hunters. His roots lay in the backcountry, and he was an excellent example of the rural Tennessean, the backwoods man who could shoot a squirrel with a shotgun and then make a fire from scratch. When the Great War began, York attempted to gain conscientious objector status. When this was in doubt, he agreed to serve in the American Expeditionary Force. Going to France, York reached the level of corporal, which seemed like the summit of both his ambitions and his abilities. But this was not the case. On October 20th, 1918, York was sent by his commanding officer to lead a small group of U.S. soldiers to capture a German machine gun nest. The Americans succeeded in this action, but they later came under fire, and for some time it seemed as if the entire detachment had been wiped out. Instead, York returned in the late afternoon. Though he had a handful of U.S. soldiers accompanying him, it became clear that York had single-handedly killed about 25 Germans and that he had brought back 132 prisoners. The early 20s. American women had won the right to vote. Now, in the early 20s, they stepped out socially. This was evident in the appearance of the so-called flappers, young women who wore shorter skirts and flimsier blouses and sometimes smoked cigarettes in public. Young women now held clerical and office jobs, and women's colleges became prevalent. Birth control had long been practiced in quiet ways, but actual medicine or contraception became available in the early 20s. The spread of these contraceptives was highly controversial, and some middle-aged Americans lamented the loss of innocence and purity. Once birth control methods became more widely understood, however, there was no turning back the clock. The 20s are one of the most studied of American decades. This is because the 20s displayed such markedly different examples of liberalism and conservatism. On the one hand, millions of Americans went out of their way to demonstrate liberal, feel-good attitudes. At the same time, millions of others went out of their way to affirm traditional values. As a deeply rural state, Tennessee showed more of the latter than the former, though there were some important exceptions, especially in the world of music. America's first Red Scare. By 1920, most Americans were convinced they had been cheated out of victory in the Great War. Battlefield victory had not been enough to ensure that the post-war world turned out in an American direction. Making matters worse was the establishment of a communist regime in Russia. The government of Tsar Nicholas II fell in 1917 and was soon replaced by the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known as Lenin. The communist takeover of Russia led to the first Red Scare in the U.S. The effects were felt throughout the nation, but there was special concentration in the Pacific Northwest because so many labor unions had strong footholds in that region. The international workers of the world were practically decimated as a result of police actions in 1918 to 1920. At the same time, the U.S. government commenced a series of raids against so-called undesirables. In 1919 to 1920, the federal government carried out a series of raids, the Palmer Raids, on suspected communists and socialists. The raids seldom produced much in the way of evidence or arrests, but the government soon found a common denominator. Many suspected communists or socialists were aliens, and it proved relatively easy to classify and deport many of them as undesirables. This, in turn, led to increased calls for limits on immigration. By 1922, the nation was well on its way to becoming a stronghold of isolationism. Politics in the 1920s. Isolationism. Isolationism grew from the persistent feeling that the U.S. had been cheated of its success in the Great War. There was some truth to the assertion. America had done great things in the war's final year, and its forces had perhaps done the most to ensure the final victory. However, isolationism came from a more painful source: the failure of the Versailles Treaty and the U.S. rejection of the League of Nations. A solid majority of U.S. citizens believed that the Great War was a huge mistake and that the nation should not allow itself to be suckered into any kind of repeat. The election of 1920. In 1920, the Republicans nominated Warren G. Harding and Calvin C. Coolidge. The Democrats nominated James Cox and Franklin D. Roosevelt. That the Republicans would prevail was a foregone conclusion. The Democratic Party had been very popular during most of Woodrow Wilson's 2 terms in office, but the controversy over the Versailles Treaty and the Senate's rejection of it had turned those feelings sour. Harding and Coolidge swept to an easy victory, and most voters thought they had seen the last of Franklin D. Roosevelt. In this, they were of course mistaken. A return to normalcy. Normalcy is not a proper word in the English language. It is a mangled form of the word normality. But when President Warren G. Harding pledged a return to normalcy, the voters took him at his word, and the 18th Amendment promised to do the same. Warren G. Harding ratified in 1919 the 18th Amendment, also known as the Volstead Act, established prohibition, forbidding both the making and the sale of alcoholic beverages. The amendment was an outgrowth of the progressive movement, which rightly pointed to thousands of broken homes, broken as a result of alcohol. But this was one case where the progressives went too far. Though many Americans obeyed the law, those who did not manage to sensationalize their efforts. The 18th Amendment may even, in certain areas, have led to an increased consumption. Many people around the nation either made their own liquor or chose to frequent speakeasies or illegal drinking establishments. Organized crime and bootlegging, where the transportation of illegal alcohol became prevalent. And alcohol was not the only provider of excitement, music and entertainment in the life of the nation. Radio appeared with a sudden burst of sound in the early 1920s. Most Americans greeted their first family radio as a revelation. For the first time, they could hear the same sounds as their neighbors down the street and their cousins in another state, and do so simultaneously. Radio led to all sorts of news and entertainment programs. It also led to the spread of the new musical forms, allowing the spread of information to a broad and vast audience. By the year 1930, the popular entertainment of most Americans had fundamentally changed. They now knew what it was to have a national music scene. Jazz. Somewhere around the year 1919, a new form of music filtered into American clubs. Labeled jazz, the new music was soft and pervasive, capable of spreading its own kind of mood. Americans had previously been crazy about ragtime, the sheet music of the 1890s and 1910s, but they now flocked to hear jazz, asserting that it was a truly American sound. While it originated in Louisiana, and more specifically New Orleans, no one person or even group of musicians can truly be called the founders of jazz. The music was subject to improvisation by almost any person who took up his or her saxophone. The blues. The birth, or origin, of the blues is just as difficult to pinpoint as that of jazz. Once the blues appeared, however, it became clear that the Louisiana Delta was the source, and that Memphis, Tennessee, was the #1 venue. Usually recognizable by long notes and melancholy sounds, the blues were as distinctive as jazz and just as recognizably American. By the late 1920s, there were thousands of Europeans, Englishmen especially, who came to live in the U.S. for years, simply because they fell in love with the new musical forms. One of the best known of these was the journalist Alistair Cooke. The experience was so vivid that it turned him into a lifetime lover of America. The blues could stand on their own because of the haunting quality of the sound. But when Bessie Smith emerged as the Empress of the Blues, the phenomenon became even greater. Born and raised in Chattanooga, Tennessee, Smith began her recording career in 1923. During a relatively short life, she elevated the blues, making them even more distinctive than previously. At the same time, blues expert W.C. Handy called himself the father of the blues. Grand Ole Opry. In November 1925, a new radio station broadcast from Nashville, Tennessee. The station broadcast country music which the callers, singers, and directors of Central Tennessee specialized in. Theirs was not the soft, undulating sound of jazz or the haunting sound of the blues, but an upbeat musical style that came from the Appalachian mountain background of the singers. Call and response was a major theme of early country music. For the first year of its life, the Grand Ole Opry played recordings of classical music. In 1926, right at the one-year anniversary, the director announced that instead of playing grand old recordings from the Western tradition, the new Grand Ole Opry would play music that harkened to the rural background of most of its performers. Tennessee's place in 20s music. There is no specific date or moment at which Tennessee earned its place as a leader in modern American music. Rather, the movement was like jazz and the blues. It could be dated approximately, but not precisely. What can be said is that Tennessee, and to some extent its neighbors of North Carolina and West Virginia, became known as the center of a new burst of sound, one that ranged from jazz to the blues to country music. All this was accomplished by about the year 1930. Sports and American heroes. The 20s displayed a strong trend toward heroism, meaning that the average American sought heroes wherever he or she could find them. This was, at least in part, due to the disillusionment many Americans felt at the end of World War I. Though they cheered for General Joseph Pershing and the returning members of the American Expeditionary Force, U.S. citizens were most excited about finding new heroes at home. Sports, athletics, and daring adventures provided many of them. One popular athlete was Babe Ruth. George Herman Ruth was his full name, but almost everyone called him simply Babe. This was due both to a charming naivete he displayed and because of the sweet swing of his baseball bat, which sent roughly 650 home runs into the bleachers. Though he is forever known as a New York Yankee, Ruth actually started his career with the Boston Red Sox, and when he was traded to the Yankees in 1920, it commenced a series of recriminations, with many Red Sox fans saying this was the beginning of the end. They were largely correct. Boston won no World Series titles between 1918 and 2004. Ruth led the Yankees to victory time and again. His ballfield performance declined in the 1930s, but his star appeal remained intact. Ruth was the athlete of the 1920s, and he set the standard against which most later sports heroes would be measured. Charles E. Lucky Lindbergh. Charles Lucky Lindbergh was a hero who never seemed to understand his own celebrity. In 1927, he made the first solo flight across the Atlantic, and when he landed in Paris, he immediately became the sensation of the 20s. Lindbergh was a first-rate aviator, but a second or even third-rate promoter. He also had the misfortune to make the wrong sort of friends, and by the late 1930s, he was as known for his pessimism and defeatism as for his skill and daring in the skies. African Americans in the 1920s. The Great Migration. Between about 1910 and 1970, in a movement that became known as the Great Migration, a large number of African Americans left the Deep South. Most of them moved to cities in the industrial North and Midwest. These blacks left the deep southern states of Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi for cities such as Chicago, Detroit, New York, and the newly established city of Gary, Indiana. They left the South to escape its ingrained racism and moved to the North and Midwest in search of industrial jobs. Most of the moves were undocumented, meaning that our evidence comes from the oral histories of families, rather than traditional forms of historical documentation. But it seems quite likely that more than 1 million African Americans moved north during those 20 years, and that the story of the African American community has never since been the same. Many of the individuals and families that moved north did not regret their decision or turn back. They may have experienced nostalgia for parts of Southern life, but they made better lives for themselves in the North. Gary, Indiana, for example, was a brand new industrial city planned and established for urban workers, and many blacks settled there. However, the single most common destination of the departing African Americans was Harlem, the community located at the extreme northern end of the island of Manhattan. The Harlem Renaissance. Starting sometime in 1924 or 1925, a new intellectual, musical, and social movement centered around African American culture commenced in Harlem. Self-conscious leaders of that movement soon called it the Harlem Renaissance, and the name has remained ever since. W.E.B. Du Bois was the grand old man of the Harlem Renaissance. Editor of The Crisis, he was an outspoken advocate for blacks advancing themselves. Du Bois was an inspired and inspiring figure who believed that blacks who attended Ivy League colleges and went on to advanced intellectual programs were by far the most important, the talented 10th, as he called them. This intellectual elitism led Du Bois to ignore some African Americans who made outstanding progress at the lower grades of social and intellectual distinction. Louis Satchmo Armstrong was by far the best-known African American musician. Born in New Orleans, he used his legendary skill at the saxophone first to escape severe poverty and then to broadcast African American musical talent to the wider world. Though he came from the Deep South, Armstrong was able to appeal to northern and southern audiences, and he also took his band to Europe, where he was regarded as the #1 African American musical talent the U.S. had yet produced. Langston Hughes was a poet and writer of prose. Born in Missouri, he came from an impoverished black family that had memories of greatness. One of his ancestors had fought with the abolitionist John Brown, for example. Hughes wrote more books and poems than almost any other member of the Harlem Renaissance, but he is often known for the very first one he published, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston was an African-American poet, folklorist, and writer of prose. Born in a Florida township that had no whites, she always looked for the wider world. Many years in the folklore field brought out her talent, which was revealed in books such as Their Eyes Were Watching God. Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington was born and raised in Washington, D.C., but he made his name and fortune in New York City. An extremely versatile writer of songs, he was also a supremely talented band leader, although some critics claimed he lifted or stole much of his material from fellow band members. The Duke Ellington Orchestra played for nearly 50 years, and most of the original members were long gone when the Duke continued to play. Talents such as Duke Ellington, Langston Hughes, and Zora Neale Hurston were followed by many others, some of whose names have been lost over time. However, there is no doubt that they collectively changed the direction and momentum of African American culture. Garveyism. Marcus Garvey was a Jamaican-born political leader who came to New York City in 1915. Blessed with a tremendous speaking voice and enormous personal energy, he set many African Americans on fire with his Back to Africa movement. Garvey organized parades, at which he and his top political allies dressed in uniforms. He also organized the first of what might have been the start of ships headed to Africa. But Garvey was found guilty of mail fraud in 1924, and his movement, Garveyism, soon sputtered. The automobile and the movies. The radio did something amazing. It brought entertainment as well as news right to the home. Many Americans continued to like going out, however, and their opportunities brightened during the 1920s, thanks first to the automobile and then the widespread dissemination of movies. Henry Ford was the carmaker genius who changed the lives of millions of Americans. The first Model T Ford rolled off his manufacturer's lot in Detroit in 1908, and more than 20 million others followed in the 2 decades after. Ford wanted his employees also to be his customers, and he therefore paid the previously unheard-of wage of $5 per day. The Model T became the people's car, meaning that many families could afford one. The automobile created personal freedom for millions of Americans. Their parents and grandparents might lament the loss of traditional values, but people in the teens and 20s clearly liked the freedom to get up and go, whether this was to the local shops or on far-off drives. The automobile also allowed cities to grow much larger because workers could live further away from downtown. Another aspect of American life that changed was attendance at the movies. There were no talking movies in the 20s. These were silent films. But the popularity of those films was immense. The most popular of all American actors was actually English-born Charlie Chaplin. Through a career spanning 3 decades, Chaplin popularized the image of the little tramp, the sad-faced and sometimes forlorn person who bravely made his way through life despite numerous mishaps. For millions of moviegoers, Chaplin was the movie star of the 20s and 30s, the person who did the most to make the big screen come alive. Cultural and social changes. The Scopes monkey trial. In 1925, Dayton, Tennessee, was one of the smaller and lesser-known of all U.S. cities. Located in south-central Tennessee, Dayton was a sleepy place with a late 19th century feel. However, a series of events brought Dayton to the attention of the world, and the world, in the form of journalists, came to Dayton. Tennessee passed a law prohibiting the teaching of evolution, the central concept of Charles Darwin, in the public schools. A test case was made in the form of high school teacher John T. Scopes. When the news spread, hundreds of journalists and thousands of eager observers made their way to Dayton for what was called the Scopes monkey trial. The monkey part came from the fact that Charles Darwin's later writings, especially his book The Descent of Man, suggested that humans either were descended from chimpanzees or were at least closely related to them. This idea was deeply repugnant to most traditionally minded Americans. The defense attorneys included the single most famous name in American trials. Clarence Darrow had made a fortune defending people accused of all sorts of crimes. His great talent lay in suggesting the weaknesses inherent in a prosecutor's argument. The prosecution hired many attorneys, the most famous of whom was William Jennings Bryan, who had run for the presidency in 1896 on a platform that called for a bimetallic currency. Bryan was 29 years older than in 1896 and did not speak as eloquently as he had in the past, but his reputation more than made up for this. The trial was sensational. Numerous witnesses were called and questioned. At issue was both whether Tennessee could outlaw the teaching of evolution and the entire controversy between those who believe in creationism and those who believed in evolution. The difficulty of the trial, naturally, revolved around the fact that neither legislation nor a court trial could change people's minds. They would continue to believe as before. The climactic scenes were especially colorful. Held on the 3rd floor of an extremely hot courthouse, the trial produced many arguments and counterarguments. On the final day of the proceedings, it was so hot that the judge brought the entire courtroom out of the building and onto the lawn. There took place the showdown between Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan. The latter made a tactical error in allowing himself to be cross-examined as an expert on the Bible. Darrow won the confrontation. He embarrassed Bryan with Bryan's obvious lack of scientific understanding, showing that a person could indeed read and know the Bible, yet be out of touch where modern knowledge was concerned. The actual case was decided in favor of the prosecution. John T. Scopes was given a $100 fine, and the case was over. But the result was largely in favor of those who believed in evolution, or at least those who supported it being taught in public schools. Of course, that does not mean that liberal and progressive beliefs won every public fight. In fact, the mid-1920s sometimes seemed like a throwback to the 1890s or even the 1880s. Immigration controversy. In 1924, President Calvin Coolidge, who came to office after the sudden death of Warren G. Harding, signed the Immigration Act, clearly aimed at the new immigrants, those that arrived after about the year 1850. The Immigration Act established quotas based on the number and percentage of each national group. Then in the U.S., traditionalists hailed the new law, while liberals and progressives reviled it. But the mood of the nation was clear. Foreigners, especially those from Eastern and Southern Europe, were not welcome. The KKK returns. Much to the surprise of many U.S. citizens, the Ku Klux Klan made a strong comeback in the early 1920s. The organization had been powerful in the 1860s and 1870s, but it practically died in the 1880s. The new Klan, that which was born in Georgia in 1915, was anti-black, but also anti-immigrant and foreigners in general. The new emphasis on keeping foreigners and others out of the U.S. briefly gave the KKK an enhanced image, and in 1923, it was asserted that there were 5 million members. But that same year also witnessed a scandal involving the governor of Indiana, a Klan leader, who was implicated in the seduction of a minor. Within 2 years, Klan membership fell off dramatically. Changes in U.S. economics. The last 3 years of the 20s witnessed a significant, even dramatic, rise in the U.S. stock market. Centered on Wall Street in Lower Manhattan, the stock market saw a dizzying rise in values between 1925 and 1929. This rise encouraged many potential investors to get off the fence and into the mainstream of stock investing, rather than be left behind. Consumerism was already a significant part of U.S. society, but the credit changes of the mid-1920s meant more people purchased more goods than ever before. Radios and automobiles were at the top of many lists, but washing machines, electric vacuum cleaners, and even the first air conditioning units were not far behind. Making many purchases possible was the new means of buying on margin. Buying on margin meant investors could borrow as much as 80% of the value of the stocks they purchased. As long as the stock market rose and the values of those particular stocks increased, investors were far ahead. But if the stock market plunged, investors could be subject to margin calls. This meant the bank or other lenders could suddenly demand the return of the 80% which had previously been lent. The stock market crash of 1929. Throughout the early autumn of 1929, investors and bankers quietly expressed fear that the U.S. economy was in a slowdown. Orders for new consumer items, including automobiles, were fewer than in the previous year. No one wanted to admit the painful yet clear fact that the U.S. consumer was overextended. Many consumers now had a home and 2 automobiles in the driveway, as well as a host of other modern conveniences. Many other consumers did not possess these things, but could not afford to purchase them. Regardless of which consumer group one belonged to, the result was the same. There were fewer orders, fewer purchases, and long rows of shelves that had not drawn in the latest customers. October 29, 1929, has forever since been known as Black Tuesday, the terrible day when stock market prices tumbled across the board. That Tuesday was the single worst day of a truly terrible week, when some companies and corporations lost as much as half of their paper value. Tough-minded investors declared that this was the time to be strong, to hold on to stocks regardless of how low they fell. But buying on margin and consumer credit had brought hundreds of thousands of new investors into the market, and most of them were not equipped materially or psychologically to handle this sudden change. Many sold all their stock certificates for pennies on the dollar, causing even greater losses all around. Did the stock market crash of 1929 have to lead to a massive economic depression? Economists have asked this question for decades. The general consensus is that the events of October 1929 represented a perfect storm, a mixture of economic and financial concern fired by a sense of panic from which the U.S. economy could not rapidly recover.